Have you ever stopped to really think about what the human body goes through right after childbirth? Society loves to focus on the arrival of the newborn, right? But the transition to postpartum is honestly one of the most profound, dramatic, and rapid physiological shifts in the entire human experience. It's literally a biological earthquake. Yet, for something so incredibly universal, it is still so deeply misunderstood. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a structured, clinical look at what happens when that massive physiological shift triggers something entirely unexpected. We are decoding perinatal mood disorders. We're going to strip away the cultural myths, look straight at the neurobiology, and really dig into the data to understand exactly what is happening in the maternal brain. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining the postpartum mood spectrum, unlock the biological triggers, and examine the ripple effect on children. Then we'll look at how clinicians actually spot the signs, and finally, explore some truly revolutionary new frontiers in treatment. Let's jump right into Section 1, the postpartum mood spectrum. Before we can talk about fixing anything, we need to clearly define the clinical reality and, move past what we just think we know. You see, there's this massive disconnect between what culture expects and what medicine actually sees. As this quote perfectly highlights, our culture practically demands that childbirth be pure joy. But the clinical reality, it's a time of extreme vulnerability to mood disturbances. The intense pressure to just be happy often completely masks a very real, very serious medical event. And this vulnerability, it's not rare at all. Get this, globally, somewhere between 10 and 20% of women will experience perinatal depression. 10 to 20%. That makes it one of the most common complications of childbirth worldwide. We are talking about literally millions of individuals facing a condition that profoundly impacts their health, their relationships, and the whole family dynamic. And this brilliantly illustrates how we differentiate normal exhaustion from actual clinical pathology. Basically, we're looking at three distinct things here. First, the baby blues. This affects up to 80% of new mothers. It's a totally normative hormonal adjustment, usually resolves within 2 weeks and causes minimal impairment. Then we step into postpartum depression, or PPD. Affecting that 10 to 20%, this causes significant impairment and can drag on for months or even years if untreated. Finally, at the absolute extreme end, we have postpartum psychosis, or PPP. It's incredibly rare, affecting roughly 0.1 to 0.2%, but it is an acute psychiatric emergency involving a complete loss of reality. So, what is actually causing this pathology? Let's move to Section 2, unlocking the biological triggers. We are zooming all the way in from behavioral symptoms down to the micro level of the brain and endocrine system. The root of postpartum depression is deeply, fundamentally biological. Think about it. During peak pregnancy, a woman's body is producing estrogen and progesterone at levels hundreds of times above her normal baseline. Hundreds. But then comes delivery. Within just 48 hours after birth, those massive hormone levels plummet precipitously, right back down to pre-pregnancy states. It is basically a biological free fall. For a subset of the population with heightened sensitivity, hitting this hormonal cliff is an undeniable trigger. It's not a personal failing, it's purely biological. Now, what's really interesting about this is how that massive drop actually affects brain chemistry. Let's look at a specific progesterone metabolite called allopregnanolone. During pregnancy, this modulates the GABA-A receptor, which is the brain's major inhibitory or calming neurotransmitter. Because levels are so sky-high during pregnancy, the brain adapts by downregulating these receptors. But when delivery happens, the allopregnanolone vanishes suddenly. The receptors just don't adjust fast enough, leaving the brain in a state of severe deficit. It creates this massive hormonal gap that directly triggers intense anxiety, agitation, and depression. And compounding this massive chemical deficit is probably the most pervasive environmental stressor of all, sleep. Or, the lack of it. Clinical data reveals that 58% of new mothers suffer from genuinely poor sleep. And sure, you might think, well, obviously, there's a newborn. But this isn't just about waking up for night feeds. There's a bidirectional relationship here. Severe sleep pathology, like literally being physically unable to fall asleep even when the baby is perfectly quiet, can trigger depressive episodes, while the depression itself manifests as this terrible, hyper-aroused insomnia. So we've seen the impacts on the maternal brain. But what about the infant? Let's zoom out a bit for Section 3, the ripple effects on children. We need to explore the macro-level stakes here. We really need to signpost the stakes clearly. This isn't just about surviving a few desperately hard weeks. It reaches deep into the infant's long-term neurocognitive development. Because an infant's prefrontal cortex is highly plastic and rapidly developing, it's incredibly vulnerable to early adversity. Studies actually show that maternal depression can alter infant brain structure, connectivity, and potentially even white matter integrity. Functionally, this translates to delays in crucial executive functions, things like working memory, emotional inhibition, and cognitive flexibility. And the data strongly suggests that the chronicity and intensity of the mother's depression actually matter far more than whether it started before or after birth. The numbers here are honestly pretty striking. When researchers tracked maternal depressive trajectories over a 4-year period, they found that while 61% of mothers had few or no symptoms, 30% had persistent subclinical symptoms, and 9% suffered from persistently elevated and escalating symptoms. Just to put that into perspective, nearly 40% of children in this sample were exposed to sustained or escalating maternal depressive symptoms well into early childhood. That is actively shaping their developmental pathways. Given these incredibly high stakes for both mother and child, how do we actually find the people who need help? Let's pivot to public health solutions in Section 4, Screening and Spotting Signs. Because so many symptoms of depression, like total exhaustion and appetite changes, perfectly overlap with the completely normal demands of having a newborn, PPD is frequently underdiagnosed. Enter the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, or EPDS. Developed back in 1987, this 10-question self-report tool is still the clinical gold standard. Why? Because it was specifically designed to filter out all that noise of normal newborn exhaustion and pinpoint actual mood disorders. When you break down the core domains of the scale, it becomes a really concrete tool measuring specific things over the previous 7 days. First, it checks for anhedonia, which is the total inability to laugh or look forward to things. Then it screens for that unnecessary guilt and feelings of worthlessness that are typical of major depressive disorder. It actively isolates nonspecific anxiety, physical panic, and an overwhelmed inability to cope. And critically, just like we talked about a minute ago, it specifically screens for depressive insomnia, waking up when it's entirely unrelated to the infant's needs. So the absolutely crucial point is right here on question 10, which point blank asks if the thought of self-harm has occurred to the patient. This is an absolute clinical mandate. Regardless of what the mother scores on the rest of the entire test, any score greater than 0 on question 10 demands immediate, urgent clinical evaluation to ensure safety. It is the definitive red flag, no exceptions. Once we've identified it, how do we actually treat it? Let's dive into our final phase, Section 5, New Frontiers in Treatment. We'll see how pharmacological science is finally catching up to those biological triggers we discussed. Let's move to the treatments and see how this builds from our current standard of care. From mild to moderate cases, we heavily rely on cognitive behavioral therapy and interpersonal therapy to help restructure maladaptive thoughts, right alongside absolutely vital peer support. For moderate to severe cases, traditional antidepressants, specifically SSRIs like sertraline, are the standard. But there's a massive clinical hurdle here. SSRIs have a notoriously slow onset. They can take up to 12 weeks to reach full remission. And when an infant's brain is rapidly developing every single day, 12 weeks of impaired maternal bonding is just a desperately long time. But here's where things get revolutionary. Science has now developed novel neuroactive steroids, like zearalenone, an oral medication that was approved in 2023. Unlike traditional SSRIs that take weeks and weeks, zearalenone acts as a synthetic analog of allopregnanolone. It directly targets that GABA-A receptor deficit we talked about earlier. The result? Rapid clinical improvement by day 3. 3 days. It's a total game changer. However, this revolutionary treatment does come with significant barriers, strict requirements to suspend driving because of its sedative effects, and a pretty staggering cost of almost $16,000. So we are left standing at this incredible intersection of biological vulnerability and public health urgency. We know the profound neurocognitive stakes for the child, and we are finally unlocking the biological triggers within the mother. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. If maternal depression actively shapes the next generation's neurocognitive future, isn't it time we treat the postpartum mind with the exact same urgency and resourcefulness as we do the newborn body? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.